If you looked at the online reaction after this episode aired, you'd probably notice the same complaint over and over again. It was too slow. Nothing really happened. There weren't enough dragons. And honestly, I understand why so many people felt that way. House of the Dragon has trained us to expect shocking deaths, massive battles, and unforgettable dragon moments. So when an episode spends most of its runtime on conversations instead of combat, it's easy to think it's simply setting the stage. But I don't think that's what happened here. I think this episode is far more important than many people realize. Because beneath all those conversations, HBO quietly moved almost every major piece on the board. And by the end of this episode, the balance of power has already started to shift. You're watching Ghost Frame. On this channel, we don't just recap stories. We break down the hidden details, the writing choices, the symbolism, and the moments that are easy to miss the first time you watch. And this episode is full of those moments. So let's take a closer look. One of the biggest mistakes people make when watching House of the Dragon is assuming the war begins when dragons take flight. But George R.R. Martin has always written wars differently. Long before the first battle is fought, someone has already won or lost the political game behind it. And this episode understands that perfectly. Instead of asking, who has the biggest dragon? It asks a much more interesting question. Who is making the smartest decisions before the dragons are even needed? That's why I think the opening half of this episode feels so unusual. Almost every important scene is built around conversations, hesitation, and planning. Not because the story has slowed down, but because the war has entered a different phase. A phase where information is just as dangerous as fire. There's another subtle detail here that I think many viewers overlooked. The episode spends surprisingly little time trying to convince us that Ormond is brave. Instead, it repeatedly shows that he's organized. That distinction matters. Because bravery wins battles. Organization wins wars. It's a small difference. But it's one that George R.R. Martin returns to again and again throughout his stories. And that's exactly why this introduction works so well. The episode isn't showing us another warrior. It's introducing a man who understands logistics, discipline, and patience. In other words, someone who could become far more dangerous than a reckless dragon rider. And that's really what this entire episode is about. Not explosions. Not spectacle. Preparation. Because by the end of these 60 minutes, the biggest victory isn't measured by a castle that changed hands. Or a dragon that burned an army. It's measured by something much quieter. The realization that every side is now preparing for a war they know can no longer be avoided. And once you start looking at the episode through that lens, those slow scenes suddenly become some of the most important scenes of the entire season. Before we return to Dragonstone, the episode takes us somewhere just as important. The Green Army. At first glance, these scenes don't seem particularly exciting. No dragons. No major battles. No shocking twists. Just soldiers marching south under the command of Ormond Hightower. And yet, I think these scenes quietly explain why the Greens remain such a dangerous force. The easiest mistake to make is assuming that dragons win wars. History, both real history and George R.R. Martin's history, suggests otherwise. Dragons can destroy an army. They can't feed one. They can't repair roads. They can't convince frightened villages to open their gates. Someone has to do that. And that's exactly what Ormond is doing throughout this episode. One of the things I really appreciated is that the show refuses to romanticize military leadership. Ormond isn't charging into battle. He isn't trying to inspire his men with dramatic speeches. Instead, he spends most of his time solving practical problems. Moving people. Managing supplies. Listening to reports. Making sure the army keeps moving. It doesn't sound glamorous. But it's exactly how successful campaigns are won. There's also a clever contrast hidden inside these scenes. Think about where we've spent most of our time with Rhaenyra. Inside council chambers. Around painted tables. Surrounded by advisors. Almost every difficult decision remains theoretical. But Ormond's decisions have immediate consequences. Every mile his army marches changes the political situation. Every village that chooses not to resist strengthens the green position. Every successful day without a battle is still a victory. And that's something this episode understands extremely well. There's another moment here that deserves more attention. When the dispute between the soldier and the local family is brought before Ormond, the episode could have turned it into another scene about cruelty. Instead, it becomes a scene about responsibility. Ormond doesn't rush to judgment. He hears both sides. He asks questions. And only then does he reach a decision. Whether you agree with that decision or not isn't really the point. The important part is what the scene tells us about him. He wants his army to fear discipline, not chaos. Because an undisciplined army doesn't just destroy the enemy. Eventually, it destroys itself. That's a lesson George R.R. Martin explores constantly. The greatest threat to any kingdom often comes from within. Interestingly, Fire and Blood doesn't spend much time exploring Ormond's personality. It records what he accomplishes. The series chooses a different approach. Before asking us to respect him as a commander, it asks us to understand him as a leader. And I think that's a smart adaptation choice. By giving these quieter moments room to breathe, the show ensures that Ormond feels like a real character instead of just another name from the history books. That's why I don't think these scenes are slow at all. They're doing something much more important. They're building credibility. Because when the battles finally begin, we'll already understand why soldiers are willing to follow this man into war. And in a story like House of the Dragon, that matters just as much as any dragon ever could. One of my favorite transitions in this entire episode happens almost silently. After spending so much time with Ormond and the Green Army, the story suddenly shifts. Not to another battlefield, but to Aegon. At first, it feels like the episode is slowing down again. But it isn't. It's changing the kind of conflict we're watching. Because Aegon's greatest enemy is no longer Rhaenyra. It's the reality of everything he's lost. For most of the series, Aegon wore the crown. He sat on the Iron Throne. Power was something he inherited. Now, the throne belongs to someone else. And for the first time, the episode allows us to see him without the protection that title once gave him. One thing I really appreciated in this scene is how restrained Tom Glencarney's performance is. He doesn't need a dramatic speech to show us Aegon's state of mind. It's in the pauses. The hesitation before answering. The way he listens more carefully than he used to. The confidence we saw earlier in the series has been replaced by uncertainty. And whether you sympathize with him or not, that change makes him a far more interesting character. There's another detail that I think is easy to miss. Listen carefully to what people are actually talking about. Not dragons. Not battles. But messages. Allies. Recognition. Support. The episode quietly reminds us that wars are fought long before soldiers meet on a battlefield. Political support. Public perception. And loyal allies often matter just as much as military strength. That's one of George R.R. Martin's oldest ideas. Power doesn't exist on its own. People have to believe in it. And once they stop believing, even a king can become powerless. Interestingly, Fire and Blood mostly tells us what happened during this period. The series chooses to explore something different. It asks what defeat does to a person. How losing everything changes the way someone thinks. And that's exactly why I think these scenes are so important. The episode isn't asking us to forgive Aegon. It isn't asking us to support him either. Instead, it asks us to watch someone who has been stripped of almost everything, and see what remains. Then the episode makes another smart contrast. Every storyline feels separate. Yet each one is answering the same question. What does it actually take? To win a war? Not just a battle. A war. By the end of this chapter, the answer is becoming clearer. Dragons may decide who survives the fighting. But leadership, organization, and the ability to keep people believing in your cause will decide who wins the kingdom. Until now, almost every storyline in this episode has been about control. Commanders trying to control armies. Rulers trying to control kingdoms. Councils trying to control the future. Then the episode suddenly takes us somewhere completely different. Away from castles. Away from politics. Away from people. And into the wilderness with Rhaenyra. At first, this might feel like an interruption. But I think it's doing exactly the opposite. It's reminding us that not everything in this world can be controlled. For most of her life, Rhaenyra has lived in the shadow of other dragon riders. She belongs to one of the most powerful families in Westeros. And yet, she's always seemed like someone waiting for her own story to begin. That's what makes these scenes so compelling. She's not chasing glory. She's chasing possibility. Notice how little the episode relies on dialogue here. Instead, it allows the landscape, the silence, and Rhaenyra's determination to carry the emotion. It's a completely different rhythm from the political conversations we've been watching. And that's intentional. Because dragons have never behaved like ordinary weapons. One of the oldest ideas in George R.R. Martin's world is that dragons cannot truly be owned. They can be bonded with, respected, sometimes understood, but never completely controlled. That's why this journey feels so uncertain. Rhaenyra isn't going to claim a sword lying on the ground. She's approaching a living creature with a will of its own. And that changes everything. The episode never tells us whether she's making the right decision. Instead, it focuses on something much more interesting. Her willingness to take the risk. Because every important choice in House of the Dragon demands a leap into the unknown. Some characters gamble with armies. Others gamble with politics. Rhaenyra is gambling with her life. Fire and Blood tells us where many of these stories eventually lead. But the series chooses to slow this moment down. It wants us to experience the uncertainty alongside her. To feel the distance. The isolation. The fear. Not because the destination matters less, but because the journey tells us who Rhaenyra really is. There's another subtle detail I really like. Nobody sends Rhaenyra to do this. No council votes on it. No commander gives the order. For one of the first times in the episode, a character acts entirely on personal conviction. In an episode filled with strategy. This is instinct. In an episode filled with plans. This is faith. And maybe that's why this storyline feels so different from everything else. Because while everyone around her is trying to shape the future through politics, Rhaenyra is trusting something far older. The bond between a dragon and the person brave enough to approach it. Whether that gamble succeeds or fails, the attempt itself reminds us of something the rest of the episode quietly keeps repeating. The future of this war won't be decided by a single battle. It will be decided by the choices people make. Long before anyone knows whether those choices were right. Up until now, the Dance of the Dragons has mostly been a conflict between powerful families. Kings, queens, lords, dragon riders. But this episode quietly reminds us that another side has always existed. The people. For the first time in a long while, King's Landing doesn't feel like a backdrop. It feels like a character. The streets are speaking. Not through speeches, but through whispers. Through rumors. through words written on stone. One phrase appears again and again. Queen of Bastards. Whether the accusation is true isn't really the point. The episode isn't asking us to judge the message. It's asking us to notice that the message exists at all. Because public opinion has finally become part of the war. And once that happens, it becomes almost impossible to control. One detail I really like is that the episode doesn't rush past these moments. It spends time with the city itself. With ordinary people. With the walls carrying these accusations. That choice matters. Because it shifts our attention away from the rulers. And toward the people they hope to rule. When Rhaenyra learns what's happening, her reaction is understandable. She orders the graffiti removed. She wants those responsible identified. Any ruler facing open defiance would probably respond in a similar way. But the episode leaves an interesting question hanging in the air. Can authority erase an idea? Simply by erasing the words? History rarely works that way. And George R.R. Martin's world certainly doesn't. Again and again. His stories remind us that fear can silence people for a time. It cannot force them to believe. That's what makes the sequence so effective. The real conflict isn't happening on the walls. It's happening in the minds of the people walking past them. Interestingly, Fire and Blood often presents shifts in public opinion as historical outcomes. The series chooses to dramatize that process. Instead of telling us that support is changing, it allows us to watch that change begin. That's a strength unique to television. There's another layer here that I think deserves attention. Earlier in the episode, we watched commanders trying to control armies. Later, we watched rulers trying to protect their political position. Now, we see something neither side can truly command. The mood of the city itself. And once a city begins to doubt its rulers, that doubt has a way of spreading much faster than any army can march. By the end of this sequence, the episode isn't telling us that Rhaenyra has already lost the people. It's suggesting something much more subtle. Holding the Iron Throne and holding the confidence of the realm are not always the same thing. And that may become one of the most important battles still to come. When people talk about great episodes of House of the Dragon, they usually remember the battles, the dragons, the betrayals, the moments everyone saw coming. I have a feeling this episode will be remembered for something very different. Not because of what happened, but because of what it quietly prepared. Think about where every major character stands by the end of the episode. Ormond has an army that's still moving. Aegon has lost a kingdom, but not his claim. Rhaenyra sits the Iron Throne. Yet the streets of King's Landing are no longer completely behind her. And somewhere far from courts and councils, Rhaenyra is chasing a possibility that could reshape the balance of power entirely. None of these stories reaches a conclusion. They're not supposed to. Because this episode isn't trying to deliver a payoff. It's positioning every piece before the next move. That's why I think so many viewers walked away feeling that nothing happened. We're used to measuring progress through battles, through deaths, through spectacular moments. This episode measures progress differently. Every conversation changes a relationship. Every decision changes a future alliance. Every rumor changes what people believe. And sometimes, those quiet changes become far more important than a battlefield victory. George R.R. Martin has always understood that power isn't just something you hold. It's something other people agree that you have. The moment that belief begins to crack, everything built on top of it starts to crack as well. That's the idea I kept coming back to while watching this episode. Not who has the biggest dragon. Not who controls the largest army. But who still has something much harder to earn. Trust. Maybe that's the real subject of this episode. Trust between rulers and their people. Trust between commanders and their soldiers. Trust between a dragon and the person bold enough to approach it. And the person bold enough to approach it. By the end of the hour, every one of those relationships has changed. Some only by a little, others forever. And that's why I think this episode deserves a second watch. Because once you know where to look, it's no longer an episode where nothing happens. It's an episode where almost everything begins. If you enjoyed this breakdown, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What was the one quiet moment in this episode that you think most viewers overlooked? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy deep analysis of House of the Dragon, films, and television storytelling, consider subscribing to Ghost Frame. Because sometimes, the biggest moments aren't the ones that arrive with Dragonfire.